The international community can no longer drag its feet on climate change, says the United Nations Environment Program. So what's preventing a more urgent and unified response? Meantime, a Chinese group produces a scathing article about human rights hypocrisy by the Americans. What can be done to achieve equal rights for women in the U.S. and around the world? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Just days away from a major climate change conference, the United Nations sounded the alarm Tuesday, imploring more countries to turn their promises into action. In fact, the UN Environment Program announced that last year, the amount of greenhouse gases warming the planet actually increased. Now this, despite ambitious promises by the nearly 200 countries that signed the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So what impact has the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Accord had on global climate change efforts? And what's the link between climate change and why more Pacific Island nations are strengthening their relations with China? Joining us in our Beijing studio is Ms. Changhua, CEO of Beijing Future Innovation Center, and Mr. Harvey Dzodin, a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's talk about this. Madrid will host the annual climate change gathering next week, but ahead of that meeting at the press conference on Tuesday, the head of UN Environment Program came out and criticized signatories to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement on their so-called climate procrastination. I mean, how do you look at this? He says we need quick wins to reduce emissions, we need quick fix, and we need to catch up on the years we procrastinated. Has the world truly procrastinated on reduction?
Absolutely. She's absolutely right, because we adopted the Paris Agreement back in 2015, December, and the Paris Agreement became effective actually November of 2016, almost a year after we adopted the Paris Agreement. 3 years passed, right? If you look at the track record, and emissions continue to rise, and the impact actually we are experiencing continue to get worse, and temperature rise, natural disasters, wildfires, and flooding, droughts, storms. So we experience the sort of, consequences more and more so intensifying. But somehow, there are countries, companies, cities, regions taking actions there, but somehow whatever is on the table today just cannot meet up with what we committed actually in the Paris Agreement. That's exactly, I think, the point. Very importantly, when that happens, actually, we're literally squeezing the time and the space. Just imagine we keep postponing actually the actions to the level that's required, and humanity basically faces less and less possibility or opportunity to really deliver what we said we're going to do. That's the reality.
But what kind of quick win can the world produce at this moment? I mean, is it even realistic?
There's no quick win possible. I think the UN was too soft, actually. I think they should have said, we're headed for a climate apocalypse. We're on course for a terrible situation where the world as we know it will be drowning. I mean, you take China, for example, and you take China's project about the Greater Bay Area. A lot of those cities are going to be underwater by the year 2100 if we keep going on this course. So there's a lot to do. The problem is that it takes draconian action at this point to reverse the growth and to cut back. And we don't have the willpower to do that, unfortunately, and we're going to pay the price. Our children, our grandchildren are going to pay the price.
And that's exactly it's happening already. It's not that that's going to happen. Today, we literally live in it already.
It is already happening. And the World Meteorological Organization, that's another UN agency, predicted that the world's temperature will rise between 3 to 5 degrees in the next century. Just talk to us about what the world would look like with the temperature increase of 3 to 5 degrees.
If you look at the Paris Agreement, so the target is set already. So by the end of this century, and we set a target to say 2, but ideally actually the temperature rise no higher actually than 1.5 degrees. Scientific studies already there. If we live in a 2-degree temperature rise world, even 1.5 degrees, we're already experiencing very, extreme weathers, natural disasters, temperature rises. That's going to impact actually all the lives on the planet. That's going to impact our food safety, agriculture, water resources. If you look at the acidity of the oceans, that will be really intolerable, and the coral reefs literally almost get extinct. So that's already the scenario, right? The scientists are telling us. So just imagining, rather than 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, now we are literally on the track to 3 to 5 degrees. How could we bear that? That's just unimaginable.
What about the phenomenon of climate refugee? Will that unleash this phenomenon? What will be its impact?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to have people who are now living in cities like Guangzhou, Miami, New York, and the cities are going to be semi or completely inundated, of course, it's not going to be like Venice, which is already inundated now, as we saw a couple weeks ago. People are going to have to move to higher ground. I mean, the only possible saving grace is that maybe some technology will be invented that we don't have yet that will save people. But I don't think we can count on that technology. So I think we're heading for a climate catastrophe, and it's like a train wreck, and it's not going to be pretty, and we're not doing anything to stop it, really.
So, yes.
Yeah, one thing that's potentially preventive, say, the sea level continues to rise. What do we do? Then we build a dike, right? We just keep blocking the water away. Imagining how tall actually the dike we're going to need to build in order to survive actually that sort of disaster. That's not the future we want to live in, basically.
No, and you are calling this a catastrophe. The U.S. is now the world's #2 emitter of greenhouse gases, but ironically, it has become the first country to formally withdraw from that Paris climate agreement. How damaging is this to global effort fighting climate change?
It's extremely damaging because we plan to, or we promised to cut our emissions by 25% by 2025. We're not doing that. We're going in the opposite direction. President Trump promised to drain the swamp, but instead of draining the swamp, he's put people in place who are radical climate reactionaries. So they're people who believe in market forces to regulate this situation. And what's happening is the people who are in place in the leadership are people who are either lobbyists or leaders of major polluters.
Yeah.
So they're the bad guys. And I think this is one of the many bad marks against President Trump. But unlike some of his other terrible actions that can be reversed quite quickly, this cannot be reversed that quickly. And yes, it's true, the U.S. can go back in if President Trump is not reelected. But a lot of the damage has already been done. I'm not hopeful.
There's another deeper damage, actually, the U.S. act withdrawing. I think, we live in a world, if you look at the multilateralism, right, and we face huge challenges there. Climate change is a global issue, right, that requires multilateral governance with all the countries actually coming together. U.S. has signed up to Paris Agreement. Now with the new president in office, said, I do not like that. It's not fair to the U.S. So U.S. is the largest economy, regarded as a leader historically for a long, long time. Now basically say, okay, you signed agreement, multilateralism, whatever, but somehow you said, oops, I don't like that. The rules I'm not going to respect. That's pretty much shaking the foundation of multilateral governance already.
You bring up a great point. And I think it pains me a great deal as an American that this is happening. Because when I think back to the two leaders that put together and put the Paris Accords over the top so that they could be put into effect, were President Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama. And what does President Trump do when he comes into office? He says, no, we're not doing that. And it not only damages the planet, it damages multilateralism. On so many issues, we need to be working together, not working against each other.
And also, I think, respect, rule-based, and basically say, what do we do then? How do we address global issues like climate change by working together? So if the foundation is no longer exist, that's pretty much endangers how we govern our global issues.
Can climate change be fought without U.S. in the picture, without U.S. playing a central role here?
I don't think it's possible. I think we're all in this together. U.S. has to take on its share. But at this very moment, if you look at the numbers, say even though U.S. decided to withdraw, but if you look at requirements of the Paris Agreement, there's at least 55 nations still in it, and also 55% of the global emissions there, and that part is not impacted at this moment. But you just cannot just look at the two numbers there, right? This is a global issue. U.S. is the largest economy. we need to say that we're transitioning, transforming our global economy. If the biggest economy actually is not in it, how could we possibly address this global issue? There's no way.
Right. And in response to the UN event on Tuesday, Chinese government had a press conference on Wednesday, actually saying that the country has achieved its targets ahead of time. It wanted originally to reduce its carbon emissions by 40 to 45% by 2020. That's compared to 2005. But now it actually reduced the emission by 45.8%. I mean, how was China able to do this?
China has pretty much totally embraced the Paris Agreement commitment and internalized that into domestic development goals. China somehow is not, for the sake of my obligations, but rather China is turning the low carbon development as the development agenda. And so this is China decided this is the pathway, this is the direction journey we're going to do. So through that process, we set goals, targets, put the incentives together, enhance the laws, regulations. So now if you look at the energy efficiency, renewable energy, China pretty much, been leading the world already. But that's not adequate, even though we are achieving the target that we said we're going to do. But then put that in the global context, as you mentioned, the UN report actually say we're far beyond that. So China probably needs to catch up, even stepping up its effort. I understand that there's a fairness issue, right? As I said, China can continue to do its leadership, continue to lead, continue to contribute, but it's not totally fair. So all the weight actually needs to fall on China's shoulder. U.S. has to take on its own responsibility too.
Harvey, your thoughts? How should China respond in the face of U.S. withdrawal from the agreement?
Well, I think they need to try their hardest, China does, and I think they also have to hope that the American voters see that this is a very important issue among many other issues and decide to change the leadership of the United States. Otherwise, we are headed for an irreversible apocalypse that will affect us in ways that we can hardly imagine.
Yeah, another issue, another factor, because the climate change forecast worsens, it seems to have an unexpected impact on diplomacy as well. Some observers are saying that low-lying Pacific Island nations, for example, the Solomon Islands or Kiribati, they are the most vulnerable to rising sea levels. And they are turning to China now. It's just established diplomatic ties with China. Some predicted, or some originally said it was because economic need, but now maybe climate change is a factor too. Do you see that? Do you see it that way?
Climate change is definitely a factor because those nations see that America, unfortunately, at the moment, is not reliable. And so they're looking to China for leadership. They're looking to China for help. Like a country like Kiribati, the former president has had to buy land in Fiji to move the whole country there because it's going to be inundated. I think it's really a terrible situation. I also think they're looking to China for leadership because China is looking at those small countries as part of the Belt and Road. And we have to remember that those countries, even though they're only put together all the landmass the size of Spain, they have rights to what's in the sea and under the sea, and they have 7.7 million miles of exclusive economic zones between them, and that's very important. So I think while the U.S. is zero-summing itself out in so many ways, China is a long-term perspective and sees the goal, and I think China's doing the right thing, and I think those countries are doing the right thing. They can't depend on a President Trump who changes policies like he changes clothes.
I definitely echo Harvey's point.
Yeah, how can China help briefly?
As I said, I think those countries started to look up into China as a sort of role model in a way, because China is a developing country. If you look at the 40-year open and the reform, China has made the case. Meaning from a developing country, you have to deal with the poverty issues, development issues there. And as I mentioned early on, China is tackling climate change and taking that as a development issue, as an energy transition issue, as economic transformation issues there. Besides that, China knows very well, China is the largest emitter. It has to take on more responsibilities there. So really supporting, working with many developing countries together, actually, to enhance their capability to respond and tackle climate change, that's the right direction direction to go. So it's no surprise why more and more countries are actually looking up for China, as the leader.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Ms. Changhua and Harvey Dzodin. Good to talk to you both.
Thank you.